black are usually black. The board and notation. Chess is a game for two players. The first player, white, uses chessmen of a light color, the white pieces, while those ones of the second player, black, are usually black. The board is a square divided into 64 smaller alternating light and dark squares. There exists a system of notation describing the situation on the board and the movement of pieces and pawns. In this system, the vertical columns of squares called files are lettered from left to right: A, B, C, D, E, F, G and H. The horizontal rows of squares are called ranks and are numbered from 1 to 8, first rank, second rank, etc. Each square has its own letter and number, for instance, the E4 square. The slanting rows of squares, called diagonals, are designated by their end squares, for instance, the A2-8 and H4D8 diagonal. Whereas the colors of the squares on the ranks and files alternate, the diagonals consist of squares of the same color, either light or dark. For example, the B1H7 diagonal is light and the C1A3 is dark. The two diagonals consisting of 8 squares, A1H8 and H1A8, are called long diagonals. Initial position. At the start of the game, each side has a king Raja, a queen Mentari, 2 rooks Bentang, 2 bishops Gaja, 2 knights Kuda, 8 pawns Pawn. The pieces and pawns as a whole are called material. When the game starts, the two sides have material equality. The aim of the game is to capture the opposing king. This is called to checkmate the king. The queen and rooks are major pieces. The bishops and knights are minor pieces. The chessmen are designated by the following contractions: king, K, queen, Q, rook, R, bishop, B, knight, N, pawn, P. In game notations, the abbreviation, P, which stands for a pawn, is omitted. The distribution of the chessmen on the board at any given time is called a position or situation. Diagram shows the board at the start of play, i.e., the initial position. White occupies the first and second ranks, black the 7th and 8th. The board should be placed in such a way that there is a light corner square on each player's right-hand side, H1 for white and A8 for black. In the initial position, the white queen is on a light square, D1, and black's queen is on a dark square, D8. The left half of the chess board, from A to D, is called the Q side, and the right half, from E to H, the K side. The 4 midboard squares D4, D5, E4, E5 are called the center. This is a very important section of the board. We will talk about its significance later on. Moves. Any shift of a piece or pawn on the board is called a move. The players take turns in making moves, with white always starting the game. A player cannot move a piece or pawn to a square occupied by one of his own pieces or pawns. The knight is the only piece that can leap over a square occupied by another piece or pawn. The rook. The rook can move any number of squares along a file or rank. In this diagram, white's rook can move to any square on the E file or on the 4th rank, that is, to any one of 14 squares. The bishop. The bishop can move any number of squares along a diagonal. In this diagram, white's bishop on D4 can move to any square along the A1H8 and G1A7 diagonals, i.e., a total of 13 squares. White's other bishop has only 7 squares at its disposal. Looking at the initial position, we see that each player has one bishop that can move only on the light squares and one that moves only on the dark squares. They are often spoken of as the light squared or dark squared bishops. The queen. The queen can move any number of squares on a file, rank or diagonal is indicated on the diagram. The queen thus combines the merits of the rook and bishop and, besides, can move along both the light and dark diagonals. The diagram shows all the 27 squares the queen standing on D4, in the center of the board, can reach. This tremendous mobility makes the queen unquestionably the strongest piece. The knight. The knight moves in a very distinctive way. From E5, a dark square, white's knight can move to any of the 8 light squares marked by arrows. The knight moves from the square on which it stands over a neighboring square on the file or rank onto a square that is opposite in color to its initial position. The diagram shows how the knight jumps over the D5 square to C6 or C4, over the E6 square to D7 or F7, over the F5 square to G6 or G4, and over E4 to D3 or F3. It may be said that the knight moves one square vertically or horizontally and one more square along the diagonal. The knight always moves from a light square to a dark square, or vice versa. It is the only piece that can leap over its own or opposing chessmen, which remain in their places. Though White's knight is surrounded on all sides by his own and black pieces and pawns, this does not prevent him from reaching any of the marked squares. The knight is distinguished by its exceptional maneuverability. A well-known chess riddle is to lay out a route across the board in such a way that a knight lands on each square only once. Mathematicians have established that more than 30 million such routes are possible. Although some great minds have worked on this problem over the centuries, so far no one has determined the exact total number. The king. The king can move only one square in any direction on a rank, file or diagonal. The squares to which the kings in this diagram can move are indicated by dots. On the edge of the board the king's mobility decreases, he has at his disposal only 5 squares. When the king stands in a corner he can move to only one of 3 squares. Capture. A piece making a move can take capture an enemy piece or pawn standing in its way. That piece or pawn is removed from the board and its square is occupied by the piece making the move. The move is then considered finished. A piece can only capture a piece or pawn standing on a square to which it can move. White is to move. White's queen simultaneously threatens black's rook and bishop, and can capture one of them. Since the rook is a more valuable piece than the bishop, White takes the rook on d4. The following position arises. Before the capture.
Queen takes d4. Check.
After the capture. A player is not obliged to make a capture. Pawns. To single out any particular pawn we name the file or square on which it lands, the f-pawn, the g4 pawn, etc. The pawns are also named according to the pieces in front of which they stand in the initial position, the q-pawn, d-pawn, k-pawn, e-pawn, r-pawn, a, or h-pawn, n-pawn, b or g, b-pawn, c or f. Unlike the pieces, which can move forwards and backwards, the pawn goes only one square forward on its file at a time. The exception to this is that from its initial position, i.e., a white pawn from the 2nd rank and a black pawn from the 7th rank, it can move either 1 or 2 squares forward at once. A pawn moves only along a file, but it captures obliquely, only 1 square along a diagonal, to the left or right. On the board the white pawns move only upwards, and the black pawns downwards. Let us examine the pawn moves that can be made in the position in diagram. White's a4 pawn can move only 1 square. Since White's c-pawn is on its initial position, both
c3
and
c4. Check.
are possible. White's d4 pawn does not threaten black's king, but it can capture either one of 2 black pieces.
D takes c5.
Or
D takes e5. a5.
black can make the following pawn moves.
e6. g2. A takes b5.
Beside its usual capture, a pawn can take an enemy pawn, but not a piece en passant, in passing.
e4. e6. d4. d5. e5. f5.
Now White has the right to capture black's f-pawn en passant of its e-pawn. To do this, White removes the black pawn from the board and places the e-pawn on f6. In notation,
E takes f6.
Hence an en passant capture is the term used for taking a pawn that makes from its initial position a move of 2 squares and finds itself horizontally next to an enemy pawn. If, in the situation on board, White does not play for equal f6, she loses the right to capture the pawn. Only a white pawn on the 5th rank and a black pawn on the 4th rank can take an opposing pawn en passant. The pawn's limited mobility and attacking potential make it much weaker than any piece. Our pawns keep 1 square under fire and the others 2 squares. However, the pawn has a feature that considerably enhances its value, the right to be promoted to any piece except the king. When a player moves a pawn to the last rank, the 8th rank for white and the 1st rank for black, he can promote it at once into a piece, a queen, bishop, rook or knight of the same color irrespective of whether he still has pieces of this type. This is called pawn promotion or queening. Thanks to pawn promotion, a player may have more pieces of the same kind than in the initial position, several queens, for instance. Most frequently a pawn is transformed into the most powerful piece, a queen. When a pawn reaches the last rank, after the usual notation the abbreviated name of a new piece is given. In the position in diagram the notation. This pawn can also queen by taking the bishop on e8.
D takes e8, queen.
White can promote his/her pawn to any other piece. In this case, for instance, it would be advantageous for white to capture the bishop with the pawn and promote it to a knight, which could immediately attack black's king and queen at the same time.
D takes e8, knight, check. d8, queen.
Means that white advanced his d-pawn to d8 and promoted it to a queen. Notation. In this situation white moves the knight from e3 to c4, attacking simultaneously black's rook on b6 and pawn on d6. Such an attack is called also a double blow. Black moves the rook to b8, and white wins the pawn on d6. Now a new danger hangs over black. White threatens the bishop on c6. To avoid this threat black moves the bishop to d7. Let us register the above moves using the chess notation. White's first move is
knight c4,
in which 1 is the number of the move, n is the abbreviated name of the piece making the move, and c4 is the name of the square to which it goes. White's move and black's reply are designated by the same number. In taking a piece the sign x multiplication sign is used, for instance to kuda pukul d6. Now we can put down all the moves in the above example.
rook b8, knight takes d6, bishop d7.
3 dots are used if it is not necessary to include white's or black's move in the notation.